The wind in the park that night moved like an impatient hand, rattling dry leaves against an empty bench and carrying the distant scrape of a late tram. A lamppost threw a yellow pool on the path, and beneath it, a small scene caught Caleb Stone mid-step and held him there as if the city had pressed pause. A woman knelt on a folded blanket, her coat pulled tight against the autumn chill. Two children sat before her. A girl with hair like a dark ribbon, 6 by the way she watched everything, and a boy whose lids kept drooping as if the world were heavy with sleep. Between them, wrapped in a paper bag, was a single sandwich. The woman tore it into 3 pieces. She set the largest scraps toward the children without hesitation and tucked the smallest into the pocket beside her own ribs, as if swallowing hunger was part of the job. The smaller child, Theo, mouthed the crumbs with the slow, inefficient delight of someone who doesn't get a lot of bread. Laya, the girl, leaned close to her mother and whispered something small so that only the woman could hear. The words were soft, a private hinge in the night. Caleb couldn't make them out, but he saw the way the woman's fingers smoothed Laya's hair afterward, careful as if smoothing out an ache. The sight struck him like a memory surfacing. He had seen tenderness before, of course. His life had been crowded with gestures bought and arranged. But this tenderness had nothing to do with money. It had a poverty that made it pure. It looked like something he had been missing inside himself for years. He stood there under the lamppost long enough to realize he had been holding his breath. If this scene touches you, and you want more stories like it, subscribe. There are more to come. He watched until the trio gathered their meager things and slid, together, into the shadow of a parked van. On the driver's seat, a stuffed bear slumped, one eye sewn back on with thick thread. The woman tucked the bear beneath her chin as if it were a talisman, then, with a single smooth motion, brushed Laya's hair away from her face. That small, decisive movement, careful, private, tore something open inside Caleb. He had been very good at avoiding openings since the funeral. He had built walls of taste and distance around the place where his wife's laugh used to live. He had not known how to let anything through them that might hurt as well as heal. He walked away, the city swallowing the lamppost behind him. His steps carried him back through a glass door and into a penthouse that smelled faintly of lemon oil and regret. The rooms were too large for human hands. He had filled them with art and objects that would have made other people notice him. They made him notice his emptiness instead. Caleb made tea more out of habit than need and sat by the living room window, watching a small, anonymous light move along a far rooftop at the speed of the city's indifferent pulse. He thought of the woman in the park as if she were a photograph he'd found in an old coat. He had no right to keep looking. He had every reason to step away and forget, but he did not. Grief, he had learned, had a way of folding back into curiosity. Curiosity was safer than pity. It let him observe without giving himself away. He asked Victor, quiet, efficient Victor, who managed his affairs like a second conscience, to find out who the woman might be. No announcements, no press, just a name and a record. Victor moved like a shadow take shape. In the morning, he produced a thin file with a name at the top, Nancy Ross. Her resume was a short, stubborn arc. Once, she had worked in kitchens that mattered. She had been a sous chef whose hands had learned the music of knives and the architecture of heat. Henri Lacroix, remembered in old reviews as a creator who could take a garden and make it sing, had once guided her. Then, a car in the winter months had betrayed her wrist. Records said tendons took longer to forgive than bones. They also said she had been out of line for years, unable to lift a heavy pot with the speed the industry requires. The file smelled faintly of old starch and resilient hope. references to her palate, a note about a childhood recipe for a radish soup that Henri had loved, a forwarded letter from a community kitchen where she had cooked lunches for neighbors. Caleb read the file in the lead light of his office and found himself tracing the name on the paper as if touching the ink might conjure more. The woman in the park was not a case to be solved, but a person with a past. Knowing that calmed something and unsettled something else. He did not want to snap a solution out of thin air. He wanted to create a situation where Nancy could do what she had done before, create, without having to surrender the dignity of her choices. He thought about methods. He thought about discretion. He thought about the wrongness of being seen as a savior. He closed the file and left the room. Victor understood without question. He called a colleague in the restaurant world, a woman who still ran a small consulting firm for independent chefs, and Caleb asked a favor. Find a kitchen space he could fund anonymously, staff it with competent people, and offer market wages for honest work. No press, no acknowledgments. Help that came with a contract, not a handout. The plan, in Caleb's head, was less about giving and more about restoring a tool that had been taken away. He had not forgotten Henri's line in one of his old interviews, that food is a way to remember who you are when the world forgets you. He wanted Nancy to remember herself. He did not go to the van. He did not offer cash. He left a bag. The next morning, the bag was on the step of the van when the woman unlocked the door. Inside, there was a warm baguette, a thermos of soup, simple, clear broth with sliced radish, and an orange whose skin smelled like sun. A small, handwritten slip lay on top. Prepared with respect. If there was a recipe written there, Nancy did not let her hands show it. She drank the soup slowly, letting the warmth carry through. She put halves of the baguette into a small plastic container for the children and tucked the orange into her own pocket. It was not charity that made her pause. It was surprise. The soup tasted of something she'd almost forgotten how to make properly, the thin, precise salt that opens radish, a fat gone to its proper place, a stir that honors each ingredient. The taste pried at a leftover memory of heat and timing and a day in a packed kitchen where the noise had been more human than mechanical. The spoon in her hand trembled, not from cold, but from recognition. She did not look for the giver. She accepted the food as she accepted help most days, quietly, with the same steadiness she brought to everything. The children ate with small faces and a kind of grateful gravity that made Nancy's own hunger a different kind of ache. After they finished, she folded the paper bag and set it under the seat. There are things you do when you want to remember both the kindness and the fact that you remain responsible. Caleb watched the van from the other side of a block, unseen. He watched Nancy braid Leia's hair with a practiced hand and tuck the stuffed bear into Theo's arms. He watched her hum a song she had used as a lullaby, a thin thread of melody that traveled better than speech. He did not move. He'd learned, over time, the difference between helping and intruding. His involvement, if it happened, would be modular and small at first, a scaffold, not a palace. Victor found a kitchen 3 days later, an old bakery with a leaky roof, a space the city had listed as temporarily unused, its oven large and honest, its stainless steel top dulled from use. Caleb signed the lease in the name of a small nonprofit that ostensibly supported culinary training. He called Marco, a former line cook who owed Henri a favor, and asked him to assemble a staff and run evening shifts. Marco met him once in a parking garage, a man in a grease-stained jacket with the look of someone who had been in too many fights with stubborn ovens. "You're not putting her on a charity lap, are you?" Marco said. "No charity kitchens. Real orders, real pay. If she's good, folks will notice the work, not the story." Caleb nodded. She keeps control. Offers, not conditions. They agreed on terms: full employment, steady hours, childcare allowed on site by arrangement. Caleb insisted on no cameras, no announcements. He wanted the work to be Nancy, her hands, her recipes, her rules, so long as they ran within clear, paid parameters. Nancy came to the first interview with the practical wariness of someone who has had to say yes to things that eroded her pride. She carried the children in the way parents sometimes carry fragile things, close, considerate, always aware of potential breakage. She answered questions tersely, her wrists flexing in a way that showed both history and current reality. When Marco asked her to demonstrate a technique, she held the knife with the memory of speed and then tempered it with the present constraints. Small cuts, economical gestures. She worked the radish like a friend she'd learned to trust again. When she offered a sample of her soup to Marco, he tasted it with the same critical distance as a judge in a small-town fair, and then, for a moment, forgot to be a critic at all. The soup was exact in its simplicity. The radish gave a bright, clean note. The broth, slow simmered, carried a background of roasted bone and a whisper of bay. The kitchen, which had been more an assembly line of distrust, inhaled and listened. "Where did you learn this?" Marco asked, not unkindly. "Somewhere that had too many orders and too little room for mistakes," Nancy said. Her wrist twitched as if reaching for the memory of a pan she once held with confidence. Not a complaint, just a fact. She started the job the next week. On day 1, she came early with a thermos of coffee and a small tin of biscuits. She arranged the children's sleeping mat in a corner of the prep room where a heat lamp kept them comfortable. Laya sat on a crate and sorted napkins between tasks. Theo curled up with the bear beneath the table. They were part of her life. The kitchen made space for that instead of pretending it didn't exist. The staff watched her. There were the usual small judgments, suspicion at first, then curiosity, then the cautious admiration that arrives when skill is properly displayed. Nancy scrubbed a pan until its history gleamed like a secret. Her counted measures were exact, but flexible. She seasoned by sound as much as smell, thumbs pressing on salt like a metronome. People began to borrow utensils, to ask for a hand with a technique, to accept the quick, practiced correction of her wrist when she demonstrated a pull cut. Caleb arrived once, unseen by the staff, and sat in a corner of the small dining area during a quiet hour. He did not go by his name. He watched, not to control, but to see whether the plan was succeeding. The first time he tasted her soup, brought to the table in a bowl that steamed into the cool air, something inside him opened with a soft, private ache. The flavor pulled him back to a small kitchen where his wife had once stirred a pot late at night and hummed the same half-remembered lullaby that Nancy sang to Laya as she worked. It was not just the soup. It was the pattern of care around it, the way someone made simple things well and made them into gifts. He left a tip in the comment box the staff kept for unscheduled observations. Good product, fair work. Kept his name off the line. It felt right to him to be anonymous. The aim was not gratitude, but stability, an opportunity that would let Nancy rebuild without being placed on display. Back in the van, nights were still small battlegrounds of compromise and pride. Nancy washed dishes under a small battery lamp, the children asleep in the back with the bear tucked between them. She measured out the days in small triumphs, a sous chef's pivot that required less torque, a child who slept through a whole shift, a regular order that praised the soup without asking about the cook's history. Each victory was the kind that builds a life out of small, steady bricks. And yet, the city is not kind to things that live on edges. Word travels in odd, fast ways. Someone had seen the van in the park. Someone else had taken a photo and pinned it to a neighborhood board with questions about safety. The same civic systems that saved lives sometimes made them fragile. Nancy was used to fragility. She kept its metrics in her head and stepped carefully around them. At work, the rhythm shifted toward potential customers and larger orders. A food delivery app had started to pick up on orders for the ghost kitchen. The paid staff were suddenly producing for an audience. The team moved as a unit. Marco at the line, a young baker named Rosa sending out crisp breads, a dishwasher who hummed through the hardest hours. Nancy adjusted, teaching without speaking too much, correcting without diminishing. The gulf between past and present narrowed by practice. The soup improved under her hand and under the pressure of real service. Her wrist, too, adapted. It would never be what it had been. Her hands bore that geography now, but it could be skilled again. People began to notice. Orders multiplied, plates came back empty, and reviews, unsigned, brief, earnest, spoke of a particular, honest warmth to the food. Praise was the kind of currency Nancy knew how to spend with dignity. It did not necessarily buy a roof, but it bought options. A mechanic who would take her case seriously when she needed a tow. A small savings account opened with the first deposit of regular pay. Caleb watched the growth like someone watching a plant come up through concrete. He felt the slow softening of the grief that had made his life a series of immaculate rooms. He still wore his mourning like a tailored suit. No flamboyance, always the right cut. But the idea that someone else could be allowed to be whole again warmed him. He visited as he had planned, not as a patron, but sometimes as a quiet, unpaid inspector, as someone sampling the soup while pretending to read a menu of a kitchen he might someday patronize. He never used his name, he never made a pronouncement. He simply allowed himself to be present, to taste, to remember, and to be changed by small things. There were gestures, too, that were not money. He arranged a professional consult on ergonomics for Nancy's wrist, through a therapist who provided exercises and a small brace that took pressure off the damaged tendons. He paid for a certified childcare worker to be on site during peak hours. He wired a modest fund into the backing nonprofit's account to ensure salaries were covered while orders ramped up. Each action, he made sure, came with a signed contract. Nancy's work was not charity. It was paid labor. She was not grateful for the release of autonomy. She was pragmatic about it and, in private, relieved. People in the kitchen began to gesture toward Nancy with a new language, respect. She noticed it and let it sink in like good stock. It was an added seasoning to the slow stew of her days. One evening, after the dinner rush, and with the streetlights penciling soft lines across the floor, Nancy sat on a crate outside the kitchen and poured the children warm milk. She hummed the lullaby Sotto Voce. Laia, who had a particular habit of naming things that didn't fit neatly anywhere, asked, "Are we ever going to live inside a house?" Nancy set the cup down and looked at the way the city sky had the faint bruise of night. She had learned the civic vocabulary of no and maybe and not yet. She answered with an honesty that was small and therefore true. "I don't know," she said, "but we are inside something now. We are safe for the night. That's what I can promise." Laia considered. "Is that like when you tell me we'll have pancakes and then we do?" "Exactly like pancakes," Nancy said, and then she smiled a smile that folded gratitude into a rumor of hope. The children believed in pancakes. They believed early and often. It was an engine in their life that kept them moving forward. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked and then was quiet. Inside the kitchen, someone clapped a pot in the smallest gesture of approval, and the sound reverberated in a room full of people who had all, in different ways, come back from a smaller kind of brokenness. Caleb, meanwhile, sat in his car across the block. He watched the warm arc of orange light spill from the kitchen windows and felt the living-in smallness of a good night settle against his sternum. When the lullaby drifted out the open door, the melody tugged something loose inside him that had been wound tight for years. He thought of his wife stirring a pot the way a writer strokes a sentence into place. He thought of what he had nearly forgotten how to do, trust a slow process. He left the lot before the staff dispersed, because discretion was the point. He did not want to be intercepted or to be thanked. He wanted only the knowledge that he had created a modest, contained net for someone who had earned her way back. What he did not expect was how the feeling of living small would wake a larger concern. That night, he could not sleep. He found himself at the source of the small private trouble, a printed complaint folded in his mailbox at the foundation. Someone had noticed the van in the park again and had called a municipal hotline to report possible risks to children. The complaint used the steady, bureaucratic voice of concerned neighbors. The city, in its official way, had logged the call. Caleb read the note with the steady, clinical attention he had learned to apply to his business dealings. The note itself did not demand dramatic action. It only demanded procedure, an inspection, a welfare check, a paper trail that could take weeks to assemble and would be none the less invasive for its indirectness. He put the complaint aside, as if putting it aside could stall the movement of the world. But he could hear, in the back of his mind, the clack of a keyboard as a caseworker typed up names and addresses. He could imagine forms being filled that would ask questions about stability and residency and whether a mother could provide for her children the city defined as adequate. Back at the kitchen, Nancy folded a cloth and noticed a man who had stayed behind. He was older than most of the staff, with a grace to his manner that didn't require explanation. He watched her with a quiet intensity, but not of the kind that made her skin crawl. It made her steady. "You're different with that knife than the others," he said softly. "You don't try to make it do more than it can." He tasted the change he had been tracking in people like her, the small shift from survival to craft. There is a difference between someone who cooks to feed and someone who cooks to be seen as whole. Nancy was doing both, and the balance was not easy. "I like honest things," she said. "I've had enough of pretending." He nodded, and, for the first time since he had begun to watch her, offered something in his voice that was not a question. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said. "Whatever comes, that's what will matter." She blinked slowly, not because she needed permission, but because she appreciated the sentiment as one appreciates a warm rain in a dry month. The children, roused by the sound and by the last crumbs of dessert, yawned and curled. Nancy secured the van with practiced hands, and, as her fingers closed the door, she checked the note someone had slipped under the windshield wiper, an official stamp, a reminder of the city's algorithms. She scanned it quickly and felt a low, familiar tightening. It was a bureaucratic thing, a not urgent but still insistent notice that brought with it the potential to become urgent if no documents could be produced. She had a rental agreement that was informal, a mailing address that bent to necessity, and receipts that could be shown for last month's wages. Each of these items was a small thing, but they were also the kind of thing that could be disciplined by process and turned into proof, or lack thereof. Nancy put her head against the van and allowed herself a single, short, private surrender. She had not expected this. She had expected kitchens to be complicated and ovens to be temperamental. She had not expected the civic machinery to glance her way with the lightness of a falling leaf that might crush. She did not tell the children that night. She fed them pancakes and said the word tomorrow like a shield. She had been keeping count of tomorrows for years. She had learned to measure them by what she could do in one short day to create two small, safe ones. Caleb, in his penthouse, put his palms flat on the glass of the window and looked at the city through an old, private habit: inventory. He thought of actions and counteractions, of the tiny legalities that could be marshaled without spectacle. He thought of the value of documentation, of the way a sponsorship or a letter could be made to stand in a formal line and say, "This household is stable." Not the whole truth, but a part of it that mattered. He was careful, now, to imagine not a rescue, but a partnership. If the city's wheels were to turn their wheels, they would turn whether he intervened or not. But if he could put a weight on one side of the scale, an affidavit that Nancy had regular work, a lease for a kitchen, funds for a legitimate childcare worker, those mechanical hands might slow. He had never wanted to be a named benefactor. He had thought anonymity preserved dignity. But as the city filed its complaints, and as a small piece of paper sat in Nancy's windshield, an inconvenient thought lodged. Dignity, like a fine soup, needs seasoning and containment. Sometimes it needs proof that a life is being taken seriously. He resolved to arrange the paper without making himself the story. He would not demand her gratitude. He would not make himself a savior. He would create a frame, documents, legal counsel offered through proper channels, a slow stacking of small supports that Nancy could use if she wished. At dawn, he called his lawyer and left instructions. Find a legitimate housing inspection service. Make an inquiry under a nonprofit's auspices that could provide temporary documentation of residency while the proper leases were obtained. Set up a meeting with a social services liaison who dealt with families in transitional housing. Each step was legal, visible, and bureaucratic. Caleb liked bureaucracy because it was composed of rules he could count. He revered the idea that the world could be ordered in ways that protected people without making them into exhibits. Nancy filed the municipal notice under a folder labeled Car. She had created a system years ago for keeping paperwork that mattered. She took a picture with her hand-me-down phone and sent it to the number she had been given at work for emergencies. The line for Marco, who managed payroll and had agreed to be a point of contact. Marco called back within the hour and said, in the flat language of someone who had been a manager too long to get sentimental, "Get me everything you have, pay stubs, a printout of your schedule, we'll make copies," and he used the word "we" in a way that suggested both smallness and power. Nancy exhaled. The breath that left her was not a surrender. It was a practical admission that the world had laws and that she had to speak its language. She and Leia sat on the van's step and ate the pancakes she'd flipped inside a battered pan. Leia, with the steady hunger only children possess, asked, "Will you always be the chef, Mama?" Nancy looked at the children's faces, soft, open, brilliant in the way small faces are when they trust, and softened in reply. "I'll be the person who makes sure we have food," she said, "whatever we call it." The truth was, Nancy had never wanted to be rescued into a different life. She wanted to be recognized in the life she had chosen to rebuild. Being a chef again was not an end. It was a medium by which to claim back a sense of self. She had work, a structure, and the beginnings of a bank account. But those things were fragile when measured against an institution's need for proof. Caleb did not interfere rashly. He arranged, through proper channels, for a lawyer to be on retainer if needed, should the municipal complaint become a formal welfare check. He did more than that. He made sure the nonprofit's desk had the right documents to verify that Nancy had steady employment and that the children were cared for during working hours. He set up small, legitimate avenues that would not strip Nancy of agency, but would provide the kind of paperwork an inspector might request. He also made a human decision. He would not hide his support from Nancy forever. He would not turn her life into an extension of his capacity to fund. But he would stand with her, quietly, if necessary, in the uncomfortable places where volumes of paper and the blunt instrument of bureaucracy threatened to separate what love had already joined. Days hummed on. The kitchen's orders grew, the staff's respect hardened into a kind of mutual reliance, and Nancy's hands grew surer. The soup, the white radish recipe she'd resurrected with small improvements, became something of a signature. A food critic might have used loftier adjectives, but regular customers called it comfort you didn't see coming. People ordered it on a night when they needed a memory kept intact. Caleb paid attention to the soup, not because it illuminated his own sorrow, but because it did what food can do better than speech. It carried memory. The first time he took a spoonful at the bar of the ghost kitchen, still in his quiet, anonymous way, he tasted not a cure, but a fractal of a Christmas Eve long ago. A low light, the scrape of a chair, his wife's fingers steadying a ladle. The flavor released a quiet inside him that had been missing, not peace, but the simple recognition that someone was making something right in a small corner of the city. Nancy's hands, under pressure and under the heat lamp, were found. She began to plan, not wildly, but in the way people who have learned to trust an available future plan. She bought better gloves. She called a fixed-line number and asked about city programs. She kept receipts for every day she worked. Each act had a dignity to it because she had chosen them. And yet, the small civic complaint sat like a pebble in a shoe, an irritation that could turn to an infection if left unaddressed. Nancy filed documents. She went to daytime interviews at municipal offices and answered questions with quiet exactness. A woman from a social services desk, a brisk type with a standard issue pen, asked for proof of income. Nancy handed her a pay stub. The woman nodded, not with condescension, but with the same professional ease that sometimes comforts, mostly consoles. "We'll be in touch," she said, and the phrase contained the murmur of processes that might or might not be kind. When Nancy closed the kitchen door that night, she found a small brown envelope taped to the windshield of the van. Inside, a printed notice requested a welfare visit within the week. The official stamp was clean. The tone was neither threatening nor sympathetic. It was procedural. Nancy felt the old familiar coil tighten, and then, with the stubbornness that had gotten her this far, she prepared. She placed the envelope in the same small folder where she kept the pay stubs, the receipt from the ergonomic therapist, the photocopy of the lease for the kitchen that Marco had insisted on. The pile was growing. She made a list on the inside of her phone: documents to collect, people to call, friends who could corroborate the children's care. Each item on the list was a small weapon against the impersonal logic of forms. That night, she sat with the children and made soup for comfort. She stirred the pot slowly and hummed the lullaby. The soup warmed their hands and their bellies. Lia's head nodded against her shoulder, and Theo mumbled something that might have been a dream. Nancy watched them and thought of the city in its layers, its charities and its indifference, its particular cruelty and its occasional kindness. She had been living inside that city for a long time. She had learned how to trade small degrees of freedom for stability. She had learned to make beauty out of limited means. Across the city, Caleb sat down to his own early supper, soup served from a bowl he had purchased for reasons that were practical and irrational. He ate in quiet. When the radish's sharpness met the broth, it pried at something behind his eyes. He thought of the day he had watched a woman divide a sandwich into 3. He thought of the way tenderness could be stealthy and heroic without being boastful. He thought, too, of paperwork and petitions, of the slow machinery that might reach into the life of a small family and ask for proof of love. For all his planning, there was one element he could not control: the quotidian tremors of life. City systems and human resolve are not the same thing. They run on different tracks, and sometimes they meet with an ugly sound. He picked up his phone and typed a concise message. "How are things tonight?" He sent it without expecting a reply. He did not want to make Nancy owe anything to him. Her response came after midnight. "We're okay. For now." The phrase reached him with the kind of weight that wants to be both relieved and alarmed. He folded the phone into his palm and looked out at the sleeping city. There are times when small kindnesses draw a line, and the line must be held. He did not foresee all that would come. He did not know whether the municipal notice would swell into a full-blown removal or merely into a bureaucratic conclusion. He did know this: someone had seen a moment in a park, and it had made a decision inside him. Caleb did not move rashly. He set a plan in motion by calling the nonprofit's council and asking for appropriate legal resources on standby, and he arranged for honest proof of employment to be forwarded from the ghost kitchen's payroll to the city office if asked. He did not want to obscure Nancy's agency by purchasing silence. He wanted to provide sources of stability, so if the city's questions grew loud, there would be recorded answers. Nancy, meanwhile, slept with the children's shoes by the van door and the small, worn bear in the middle of her little domestic constellation. She had not asked to be watched. She had not asked for rooms and fortunes. She had asked, quietly, for the chance to make food again and to feed her children with that work. She had been given something else, too. Someone who had decided to stand beside her for reasons he could hardly explain without sounding theatrical. When dawn came up over a gray city, the day smelled faintly of rain. Nancy rolled up the tarp and packed the little things: cooking oil in a reused bottle, a handful of spices in a Ziploc, the small paring knife whose handle was nicked and smoothed from years of use. She hugged the children close and said the small truths as if they were instruction. We'll do this. We eat, we work, we stay together. Caleb watched, from a distance he was careful to keep, as the van pulled away from the curb and into the motion of the day. He had arranged for a small deposit to be sent to a fund that would cover a week of rent on a tiny apartment, one that met code and had a landlord who would take a chance. He had left the arrangement as an anonymous line item, a sober piece of paperwork that the nonprofit could use as needed. He leaned into the particular kind of patience worry requires, the patience of someone who is arranging scaffolding, not a miraculous fix. That afternoon, Nancy taught the staff a quicker way to cut radishes: the angle of the blade, the way the wrist translates movement into thinness, the way a small cut could change the entire face of a soup. She showed them by doing, not by commanding. A young line cook named Jessie, who had never been asked to listen before, mirrored her motion, and found it resonated with something in his own adolescence, a job he had once loved before life made him pragmatic. As she moved, Nancy felt the world rearrange itself in small increments. The customers came. The staff moved. The children slept behind a curtain on a makeshift couch that Marco had laundered and offered. The kitchen hummed like an organism. At day's end, the municipal office filed the first welfare inquiry. A case number was assigned. A social worker would visit in a matter of days. It was procedural. It was not immediate crisis. But the machinery had begun to churn, and where machinery moves, people have to make legal statements and show proof. Nancy stacked the day's receipts and placed them in the folder. She felt the old, familiar worry come back, the fear that the city might define her in ways that erased the hours of skill that made her whole. She thought, for a moment, about the man who had left the bag of soup the first week. She had not met him. She had not seen the eyes behind the extra help. She had only felt the warmth of a hot broth in a cold night. That warmth had carried more than calories. It had carried possibility. Possibility, she thought, could be made of paper and signatures if she furnished the right ones. It could also be made of the simple presence of people who believed in her competence. She trusted the folder on her lap the way a person trusts a map, both a promise and a set of directions. She trusted Marco, who had leaned his shoulder against the van and said plainly, "We'll stand with you when they come." And she trusted the steady rhythm of work that now measured her days. She did not yet know whether that trust would be enough to quiet the city's procedures, but she knew how to prepare. Receipts sorted, references lined up, ledger entries neat as stitches. When the social worker arrived 2 days later, she wore the professionally neutral colors of someone whose job was to sift evidence without drama. Her badge announced a name that sounded like a consonant in a larger machine. She asked questions with the kind of steady voice that required short answers. Nancy gave them. Proof of employment. Marco handed over a copy of the signed contract. Pay stubs. Printed, stamped, clean. Child care arrangements. The certified worker's card tucked into a plastic sleeve. A neighbor's note. Someone from the kitchen who had seen the family at quiet hours. Each document was a small rod that could be placed into a larger frame. The social worker looked through the papers with the same considered expression she'd used to ask the questions. She walked the van's perimeter with a clipboard and measured the space in ways Nancy had prepared for. Smoke detector present, bedding adequate, food visible and properly stored. She asked, gently, whether Nancy could produce a mailing address. Nancy offered the nonprofits box where her mail could legally be forwarded. The social worker made notes and said the key words Nancy had heard before. "We have to make a report." Then, softer, "We'll include your employment in our assessment." It did not promise anything. It did, however, acknowledge that there was a record being made that might save them. Those days that followed were raw in their quietness. Nancy found herself filling out forms with the steady hand of a person who knew what was at stake and resented that the basic facts of life could require so much explanation. Laya sat beside her at the table in the corner of the prep room and drew a picture of the van in crayon, sun hugging the roof as if to make it permanent. Theo fell asleep with the stuffed bear tucked under his chin, the repaired eye catching the kitchen lamp like a small moon. Caleb watched the unfolding with an ache that felt both careful and urgent. He had not intended to be seen in the way that might alter the shape of Nancy's work, and yet he had to reckon with the fact that the city had the power to separate what love had already held together. He scheduled a meeting with the Nonprofits Council and asked that whoever represented Nancy be someone used to both courtrooms and human rhythms, a lawyer who could translate the language of forms into the reality of a mother's life. He authorized funds for legal counsel in Nancy's name, funded through the nonprofit, so the assistance would read as organizational help rather than private charity. When the notice progressed from a municipal inquiry to a formal hearing, it felt less like a sudden rainstorm than like the slow swell of a tide. The hearing was not dramatic television. It was precise and juridical. A courtroom smelled of wood polish and paper. The judge wore the undisputed calm of someone whose work was to weigh documents and decisions with careful hands. Representatives from Child Protective Services were present with their own binders, factual records and checklists, while Nancy arrived with Marco at her side, her attorney a woman who had the plain competence of someone who once woke early to read cases. The first part of the hearing scanned the municipal findings and the procedural steps that had been taken. The social worker read her notes into the room. Welfare check, van residency, proof of employment pending verification. A CPS caseworker spoke in the voice of caution. Phrases like potential risk and need for stability were used not to vilify but to index concern. The judge asked questions that had the soft, neutral fairness of someone trying not to commit without evidence. "Do you have documentation of steady employment?" the judge asked. Nancy's attorney slid forward a tidy stack. Pay stubs, a copy of the signed nonprofit contract, affidavits from 2 staff members attesting to Nancy's punctuality and responsibility. Marco stood and, with a manager's blunt clarity, described the kitchen structure. Paid shifts, childcare provision during peak hours, a savings plan for Nancy that was gradually accumulating. The courtroom took in the details like notes in a ledger, genuine, verifiable, practical. Even so, paperwork is rarely enough by itself. The judge's job was to weigh not only documents, but the children's welfare in an absolute sense. The officials described the lack of a fixed residence as a concern, and the judge asked whether any formal housing arrangement was in place that could be verified. This was the moment Caleb had been bracing for, a moment that required honesty and a willingness to step into the light instead of from behind an anonymous curtain. He rose from the gallery with his hands slightly clenched, aware of how his presence might be read. He did not come to make an entrance. He came because he had prepared, in the clean way of someone who trusted legal process, an offer that would speak to the court's needs without erasing Nancy's agency. "Your Honor," he said, standing near the counsel table where Nancy's attorney had placed copies of his contact information and the documents he had authorized. "My name is Caleb Stone. I am not here to speak for Nancy. I am here to provide resources I can verify." He placed before the clerk a packet, a dated lease agreement for a small apartment, one that met the city's codes, signed by a landlord who had agreed to the arrangement, the nonprofit's verification of deposit and first month's rent, and a letter from the nonprofit confirming that funds for childcare and legal counsel had been allocated. He also submitted an affidavit from the ergonomics therapist describing the reasonable accommodation for Nancy's wrist and a plan for additional vocational support should she wish to expand her business. Caleb's voice was measured. "I will provide no strings that compromise Nancy's authority as a parent or her autonomy as a chef," he said. "This is to ensure the children have verified stability while their legal residency questions are settled. I will also make myself available as a point of contact for the nonprofit and hold that support in the open, legal channels we have presented." The room absorbed the offers like someone taking in a map. The judge asked a few pointed questions. What was the timeline for the lease? Who would oversee the funds? Were there contingencies? Caleb's counsel answered. Nancy's lawyer explained the nonprofit's governance. The landlord confirmed the lease had been signed and would be effective within 10 days. The judge regarded the materials with the coolness of someone for whom documents are often decisive. "This court," the judge said finally, "is tasked with doing what serves the children's safety while preserving family unity whenever possible. Given the documentation provided here and the fact that there is ongoing employment verified with childcare arrangements, I will not grant temporary removal at this time. I will keep the case open pending confirmation of the lease and continued compliance with the service plan. Court will reconvene in 30 days. It was not a euphoric victory. It was a legal holding pattern that nonetheless kept the family together. Nancy felt the lift of relief in the way she felt a pot settle when heat was removed. Not euphoria, but the quiet easing that comes when danger is averted through concrete action. She had not been rescued. No one had swooped in to erase her difficulty, but the process had been marshaled in a way that respected her role as mother and professional. The court had asked for verification, and verification had been provided. Outside the courthouse, under a sky that had the bleaching patience of late morning, Caleb waited for Nancy and Marco to emerge. He did not expect thanks, but when Nancy stepped into the light and saw him, her face betrayed a moment of complex recognition. Gratitude mixed with the old, careful wariness that comes when someone intrudes into a private life, however politely. "You didn't have to," she began. "I know," he said, "and I didn't want anonymity to become a way to take your story. I wanted structure. You make the rest." She looked at the packet in his hands and then at him, not quite trusting words for the moment. "We did what we could," she said instead. The sentence an act of partnership. They arranged the move to the small apartment with the practical, unromantic efficiency they had both come to favor. Boxes were modest and purposeful. A pot she liked, a child's cup, the paring knife with its nicked handle wrapped in an old dish towel. The van was traded for an address that didn't demand explanation. The landlord, who smelled faintly of coffee and had a habit of whistling when he fitted keys, handed over a ring and said, "Welcome, folks. Keep it warm." The apartment was small and had a kitchen that would not pretend to be grand. It had a window that looked onto a street where the trees shook loose confetti of leaves each evening. For the first time in months, Theo slept under a regular roof. Laia inspected the space as a surveyor would inspect a new territory, and then announced, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child, that the next morning they would have pancakes. Nancy accepted Caleb's help in the language she knew best, by setting the table. She bought a small jar of good salt with the first payroll deposit she had not immediately earmarked for a necessity. She hung the stuffed bear on a hook near the door where the light would catch its mended eye. The move did not alter the lines of her existence, it merely provided a platform on which she could build. As the weeks passed and the kitchen's orders stabilized, an odd intimacy grew between Nancy and Caleb. Not the thudding, instantaneous kind that the movies prefer, but a gradual unwrapping. He came to the kitchen sometimes and sat at the bar under the pretense of sampling the menu for his own curiosity. He rarely used his name. When they did speak, the conversations were short and meaningful, about knives and timing, about a particular way to coax the sweetness out of a roasted carrot. He asked practical questions about her wrist and listened when she described the ways she'd adapted her technique. In quiet moments, the two of them shared pain and memory with a care that did not aim to equalize, but to recognize. Caleb spoke, slowly, of his wife's absence in terms that were honest. Not cinematic grief, but practical loneliness, a daily accounting of the things he missed. Her laugh over the sink, the way she tied the tea towel at the hip. Nancy spoke, sometimes with laughter and sometimes with anger, about the small humiliations of poverty and the unexpected dignity of having her skill acknowledged. "You make people come back," Caleb told her one evening, watching a slow line of customers that arrived for the soup. "They don't always know why, but they do." "It's not mine to hoard," she replied, wiping a bowl. "Food's a way people tell each other they're not alone. I just help them say it." Their mutual respect was not a tidy romance. It had friction, the way two lives that had not been built for each other might collide and create sparks that were not necessarily romantic, but could, with time, become so. Nancy guarded the threshold of intimacy carefully. She had seen too many promises dissolve and too many newcomers leave when the weight of daily survival pushed. Caleb, who had been affluent in the architecture of his life, learned how to take small risks that were not about money, sharing a memory, admitting an anxiety, entering a space where he might be unmoored. The community around the kitchen responded to the steady rhythm of the work. Neighbors came in for soup and stayed for advice on landlords. People who had little time for ceremony offered favors in the only currency they had: a handyman's skill, a refurbished child's bike, the occasional bag of groceries. The restaurant staff celebrated small milestones: a week of steady shifts, a review that didn't mention backstory but praised food, and the mood was the subdued joy of people who had begun to build something durable. Then, as if the world insisted on testing the tenuousness of progress, an accident at the kitchen delivered a new complication. A line cook mishandled a pan during a busy service, and a small fire started in an upper shelf where old oils had been stored. It was contained quickly. Marco's quick thinking and a working extinguisher prevented disaster. Still, the incident triggered an inspection. The city inspector, who had not been to the kitchen before, arrived with a checklist and measured cabinets and storage protocols with the thoroughness of a man paid to be exact. The inspector noted minor infractions: an oil can not properly labeled, a fire exit partially blocked during a rush, and wrote up a warning. The paperwork was bureaucratic but actionable: suggestions for compliance and a timeline for corrections. It was not catastrophic, but the timing was poor. CPS had kept the family's case open for reevaluation, and any sign of instability could reframe perceptions. Nancy took the notice personally, in the way someone takes a critique of their work. Her hands tightened around a wooden spoon. "We'll fix it tonight," she said to the staff, and they did. They labeled cans, cleared exits, audited extinguishers, and uploaded receipts to a shared folder. The kitchen became, for a few days, a place of disciplined activity as the team tightened standards to match the scrutiny. Caleb, who watched the team move with the same quiet admiration he had shown since the beginning, offered practical help: a contractor who could install safer shelving, funds to replace aged containers, and a meeting with an inspector he'd worked with on other properties, who agreed to do a preliminary review and provide a letter documenting compliance. None of this erased the reality that the family had been under scrutiny. It merely showed again that diligence and credibility could counter bureaucratic anxiety. The judge's follow-up review day loomed, and the nonprofit prepared a bundle of updated documentation: invoices for the contracted repairs, a letter from the safety inspector, updated payroll records, and notes from the childcare worker confirming continued attendance. Nancy, who had learned how to handle public scrutiny with the same steady hands she used at the stove, attended the hearing again, not as a supplicant, but as a professional presenting evidence that the household now aligned with the city's expectations. This time, the judge's questions were shorter. The documentation showed improvements, and the caseworker noted that the children had not been removed and that the family had complied with the service plan. There was no dramatic ruling. The decision was, for the family, the most humane possible. Continued supervision with the understanding that the family was making reasonable progress. When the formalities were completed and the paperwork filed, a small sense of victory passed through the kitchen like steam off a pot. They had not won anything grand. They had instead established a rhythm that allowed them to remain intact. Nancy's victory was not just legal, it was the sustained proof that her work could be recognized as the scaffolding of a life. As the legal cloud receded, Caleb and Nancy spoke more often, not through the big, empty spaces of the penthouse or the van, but in the everyday detail of the kitchen, an extra pinch of salt, an idiosyncratic tilt of a plate, the way Michael, one of the new regulars, always asked for the soup with an additional slice of radish. Their closeness grew like slow dough as they both let time and labor do what contrived gestures could not, build familiarity that felt worth keeping. He wanted her name on the window. He wanted the sign to read, plainly and proudly, her identity as both artist and proprietor. The opening day had the small, electric feel of a community rite. Regulars came with flowers and small jars of preserves. Marco had a grin that looked almost like a salute. Rosa brought a tray of tartlets. The landlord, who had watched the small apartment settle into a real home, stood near the back and clapped. The ribbon was not cut by a mayor or a celebrity, it was cut by Laia, who had been given the honor because, in the end, family mattered most. She snipped the ribbon with a child's scissors and then ran inside to claim her favorite corner booth. The sign above the door read, "Nancy's Table, where recipes remember." People liked the phrase for its gentle promise. It didn't make grand claims. It simply suggested that what happens around a table is the kind of work that keeps memory and belonging alive. The restaurant, once the doors opened to the public, felt like a living thing. Plates arrived with the modest beauty Nancy favored. Steady, unpretentious, exact. The soup, her white radish recipe, sat on the menu like a quiet hymn. It was ordered in both sorrow and celebration. It was requested at the end of funerals as a finite comfort, and at birthdays as an honest, grounding course. Nancy moved through the kitchen like someone in her element, issuing orders softly and correcting deftly, her wrists supported by the spared torque of ergonomic tools. Her hands were not the hands of someone restored to their past shape. They were hands that had been rebuilt in purpose and in skill. Caleb watched from his corner bar seat, a place he now occupied more often than not as an owner trying to display wealth, but as a man who had chosen a smaller, truer life. He and Nancy grew together in the slow, tacking way of people who build a life like a recipe, adding, tasting, correcting. Nearly a year from the night of the torn sandwich, the family sat in the corner booth as the Sunday light came through the windows, soft and amber. The restaurant hummed with the familiar noise of people who had come to trust the food and, in turn, the hands that made it. Laia had grown taller, as children do in the honest arithmetic of days. Theo dozed with the bear tucked under his arm, its mended eyes shining in the light. Nancy ladled the soup into bowls with the care of someone giving back the world a small mercy. Caleb watched the steam, the way it rose and cupped their faces. He thought then of the lamp-post in the park, where he had first seen her, a small scene that had rearranged his life not by theater, but by its quiet insistence. They ate in companionable silence, breaking bread not as a spectacle, but as confirmation. Around them,